The year is 1775. A restless tension hangs over the American colonies, thick in the air. What if everything you believed about freedom, loyalty, and your very identity was about to be torn apart? What if the road to independence was not paved with hope, but with bloodshed, betrayal, and unimaginable sacrifice? You might think you know the story of the American Revolution. The battles, the iconic figures, the birth of a nation. But what truly sparked this war? What were the unseen forces that drove ordinary men and women to risk everything for a cause that seemed impossible? Was it simply the British taxes, or was there something deeper, a yearning for a freedom so fierce that it would change the course of history? Imagine a world where every decision you make could lead to your execution, where every word spoken against the crown is a potential death sentence. But even then, something inside you ignites, a burning desire for liberty. Was it just about the thirst for power, or something more profound? In this video, we'll uncover the true causes and key events that led to the American Revolution. We'll take you through a journey of secrets, betrayals, and personal sacrifices, each one adding fuel to a fire that couldn't be stopped. You'll see how one misstep, one wrong move, could change the future. Stay with us as we unfold the mystery of why these men and women decided to risk everything for freedom. What led to the formation of a new nation? What pushed them beyond the breaking point? The answers will surprise you, and they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about this pivotal moment in history. Number 1. The seeds of rebellion. Why did the colonists begin to question British rule? The road to revolution didn't start with the sound of muskets or the cries of battle. It began long before, in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. But what was it that made the American colonists feel as if they were no longer subjects of a fair government, but victims of a distant, oppressive empire? Was it really the taxes, or something deeper that stirred this sense of injustice? Let's begin in the years leading up to 1763. The British government had long overlooked its American colonies, allowing them to thrive under a certain amount of self-rule. But things were about to change. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain was deep in debt and looking for ways to replenish its treasury. And who did they look to? The American colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 was one of the first major blows. A tax on paper goods might seem trivial now, but to the colonists, it was a sign that their rights as Englishmen were being stripped away. This wasn't just a tax on paper. It was a declaration that the British government had the power to control them in every aspect of their lives. But what made the Stamp Act so dangerous wasn't just the tax. It was the principle behind it. The colonists had no representation in the British Parliament. They were being taxed without a voice, without any say in the laws that governed their daily lives. And that, to them, was the heart of the issue. This was about more than money. It was about freedom, fairness, and their rights as English citizens. As the protests against the Stamp Act grew louder, many of the colonies realized that this was just the beginning. The British were not simply imposing taxes, they were asserting total control. But could the colonists stand against the most powerful empire in the world? And would the British government relent, or would it push them even further into rebellion? This was only the first spark. What would come next would shake the very foundations of the colonies. Number 2. The road to rebellion. How the British government responded to colonial resistance. The American colonists had spoken, but the British government was not listening. The year was 1770, and tensions were mounting. The repeal of the Stamp Act didn't bring peace. Instead, it was merely a temporary band-aid over a much deeper wound. The colonists had made their objections clear. They would not accept being taxed without representation. But the British were determined to hold on to their power over the colonies, no matter the cost. Enter the Townshend Acts of 1767. These laws imposed taxes on a variety of goods, including glass, tea, and paper. For the British, it was a way to assert authority, a reminder that the colonies were still under their control. For the colonists, it was an insult, one they could not ignore. Protests erupted across the colonies, and the cries of "no taxation without representation" echoed louder than ever before. But the British weren't finished. They had a different plan to deal with the unrest. They sent troops. In 1770, British soldiers were stationed in Boston to maintain order. But instead of bringing peace, they became the face of tyranny. Tensions were high, And it wasn't long before violence broke out. On March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. British soldiers, surrounded by a hostile crowd, fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. The massacre became a rallying cry for rebellion. The British claimed they acted in self-defense, but the colonists saw it as an unforgivable act of aggression. It was a turning point. The massacre was a symbol of everything the colonists had feared, that their lives and their rights were in the hands of an oppressive government that would stop at nothing to maintain control. But what would happen next? Could the colonies stand together, or would they remain divided in the face of British power? One thing was certain: the path to revolution had been set, and there was no turning back. Number 3. The Catalyst: How the Boston Tea Party Sparked the Revolution. It was 1773, and the American colonists were seething with anger. The British had pushed them to the edge, taxing them on everyday goods, stationing troops in their cities, and silencing their voices. But it was one tax, one simple tax on tea, that would become the spark that ignited the American Revolution. The British East India Company was struggling, and the British government had a solution. They would grant the company the exclusive right to sell tea to the colonies, effectively giving them a monopoly. But there was one condition: the colonies had to accept a tax on the tea. For the British, it was a way to ensure that they could still collect revenue from the colonies while protecting the failing East India Company. For the colonists, however, this was the final straw. It wasn't about the tax itself, but about the principle. The British were asserting that they could tax the colonies however they wished, and the colonists had no say in the matter. And so, in December 1773, a group of colonial patriots, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, a symbolic act of defiance against the British government. The Boston Tea Party was born. The British response was swift and brutal. They passed the Coercive Acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston's ports, revoked the colony's charter, and placed the city under martial law. But in doing so, they united the colonies. It was no longer just Boston's fight. It was a fight for all the colonies, a fight for liberty. The British had no idea what they had just done. By punishing Boston, they had awakened a sleeping giant, a force of unity and resistance that would soon be impossible to stop. Would the colonies rise up together, or would the British succeed in crushing the rebellion before it even had a chance to begin? The answer would be decided in the battles that lay ahead. Number 4. The Spark of War: What caused the colonists to take up arms? The year was 1775, and the tension between the colonies and the British had reached a boiling point. The colonies had protested, boycotted, and even rioted, but the British refused to back down. In April, the unthinkable happened. British troops, sent to confiscate colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders, clashed with colonial militia in the towns of Lexington and Concord. Why did the colonies finally resort to arms? Was it desperation, anger, or something deeper? Something fundamental about the very idea of freedom? It all began when General Thomas Gage, the British commander in North America, received orders to disarm the colonists. The British were determined to quell any organized resistance before it could gain momentum. Gage's mission was simple: seize weapons and capture leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The British troops, however, were about to make a catastrophic mistake. On April 18, 1775, British troops set out from Boston towards Concord. But the colonists, ever vigilant, had already received word of the movement. Paul Revere, along with other riders, raced to warn the militia. "The British are coming," they shouted, rallying the farmers and townspeople. The next morning, in Lexington, the first shots were fired. No one knows who fired them, whether it was a British soldier or a colonial militiaman. But that single shot, heard round the world, marked the beginning of the American Revolution. What followed was a chaotic, bloody battle at Concord. The British had expected to crush the rebellion with ease, but instead, they were met with a determined and relentless resistance. Could the colonies really win this war? Could a ragtag group of farmers, merchants, and patriots defeat the mighty British army? The answers were far from certain, but the colonies had made their choice. They had decided to fight for their freedom. But what would be the true cost of this decision? Number 5. The early struggles. Could the Continental Army stand against the British? After the battles at Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress had no choice but to form a Continental Army, with George Washington at its helm. But how could an army made up of farmers, craftsmen, and merchants stand against the might of the British Empire? Was it even possible for the colonies to succeed in such an impossible war? In June 1775, the Continental Army faced its first major test in the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British, determined to break the colonists' will, launched a frontal assault on the entrenched militia on the hills overlooking Boston. The British soldiers were well-trained, experienced, and armed with the best weapons available. But the colonial forces, although inexperienced, were determined. They fought fiercely, and while the British ultimately claimed victory, it came at a heavy cost. Nearly 1,000 British soldiers were either killed or wounded. This battle was a turning point for both sides. The British, despite their victory, realized that this was not going to be an easy war. The colonists, on the other hand, saw that they could stand up to the British and inflict heavy losses on their forces. Washington's leadership was put to the test, and the fledgling Continental Army began to take shape. But the early struggles were not without their challenges. The Continental Army was plagued with supply shortages, poorly trained soldiers, and a lack of proper equipment. Washington had to rely on the militia, who lacked discipline and often fled at the first sign of danger. The war was far from over, and there were many more challenges ahead. Could Washington unite the disparate colonies into a force strong enough to face the British? Would the Continental Army ever have enough strength to drive the British out? Number 6. The alliance. Could foreign support tip the scales? As the war raged on, the colonies found themselves facing an impossible challenge. They had the will to fight, but did they have the resources? The British Empire was one of the most powerful forces in the world, and the colonies were still struggling to put together a cohesive army. Could the colonies secure the help they needed to tip the balance of power? In 1776, the colonists took a bold step. They declared their independence from Britain. But the question remained, would the world take them seriously? Would any foreign nation be willing to support a rebellion against the British Empire? The answer came in the form of France. Ever since the end of the 7 Years' War, France had been itching for revenge against Britain. They saw an opportunity to weaken Britain by supporting its American colonies. After the American victory at Saratoga in 1777, which was a crucial turning point in the war, France officially entered into an alliance with the United States. The French provided much-needed military aid, including soldiers, supplies, and, perhaps most importantly, naval support. The French Navy became a critical factor in the American struggle, helping to block British reinforcements and cut off their supply lines. But what did this alliance really mean for the future of the American Revolution? Could France's involvement truly make a difference, or would it only drag the colonies deeper into the conflict? With the French now in the fight, the stakes had been raised higher than ever. The revolution was no longer just a colonial rebellion. It had become a global struggle. But was this alliance enough to defeat Britain's superior military? Only time would tell. Number 7. The darkest hour. Was America on the brink of defeat? By 1780, the American Revolution had reached its most desperate point. The colonies were losing ground, the Continental Army was in disarray, and morale was at an all-time low. Washington's army had been forced to retreat again and again, and the British seemed to have the upper hand. Could America survive the darkest hour of the Revolution? The British, under the command of General Cornwallis, had made significant gains. They had captured major southern cities like Charleston and Savannah. Many believed the war was nearing its end, with the British poised to crush the rebellion once and for all. But the spirit of the American Revolution was far from broken. Washington's army was bolstered by the help of the French, and new leadership emerged in the southern states. Guerrilla warfare tactics, led by figures like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, began to turn the tide. These small, but effective, attacks on British supply lines and communication routes were causing serious damage to the British forces. Then, in 1781, the unthinkable happened. The Battle of Yorktown became the final, decisive moment of the Revolution. Cornwallis, cornered and exhausted, was forced to surrender to Washington's army, aided by French forces. The British had been defeated. But how close were the colonies to losing the war entirely? Would the Revolution have succeeded without the help of France? And what would the consequences have been if Washington had failed at Yorktown? The answers to these questions would shape the future of the fledgling United States. Number 8. The Treaty of Paris. Was the fight really over? The Battle of Yorktown in 1781 had effectively sealed the fate of the American Revolution. With the surrender of Cornwallis and the British forces, the dream of American independence seemed within reach. But as the British finally began to retreat, a new question arose. Was the war truly over? Could the colonies, now on the brink of victory, secure peace without further bloodshed? The road to peace was long and fraught with challenges. The Treaty of Paris negotiations began in 1782, but the path to a final agreement would test the resolve of the American leaders. There were many thorny issues to resolve, not the least of which was the borders of the new nation. How would the United States territory be divided? What would happen to the British loyalists, the ones who had sided with Britain during the war? And could America, so recently a divided group of colonies, now form a unified government capable of maintaining peace? The British had to accept reality. The war had drained their resources, and despite their military prowess, they could no longer afford to maintain control over the American colonies. But the Americans had their own battles to fight. Diplomatically, the United States had to secure a treaty that would not only recognize their independence but also guarantee their survival as a new nation. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, would officially end the war and recognize the United States of America as an independent nation. But even then, the fight wasn't entirely over. The treaty did not resolve every conflict. Loyalists were left without protection, and tensions with Native American tribes would soon escalate. Was the United States truly free, or was it merely at the beginning of a new set of struggles? And what would it take for the new nation to hold its ground in the years to come? Number 9. The legacy. What impact did the Revolution have on the world? The American Revolution was not just a colonial rebellion. It was a spark that ignited a fire that would spread across the globe. But what was the true legacy of the Revolution? How did the events of the 1770s shape the world beyond the American continent? The birth of the United States had a profound impact on the global stage. The American Revolution sent a clear message to the world. It was possible for a people to overthrow a powerful empire and form a government based on the ideals of liberty, equality, and self-determination. It inspired revolutions in France, Latin America, and beyond. The American colonists had proven that a monarchy could be overthrown, and a new world order could be born. But the legacy of the Revolution wasn't just about political change. It also left a cultural and philosophical mark. The ideas of the Enlightenment, particularly the belief in individual rights and the social contract, became foundational to American democracy. The American Revolution, in many ways, gave birth to the modern concept of the nation-state, one built on principles of democracy and popular sovereignty. Yet, the Revolution also left its scars. Slavery was still legal in many parts of the new nation, and Native American populations were left to fend for themselves as the United States expanded westward. The Revolution's promises of liberty and equality were not universally applied. But the ideals planted during those years would continue to grow, becoming a powerful force in the fight for civil rights and freedom across the centuries. Was the Revolution truly successful in its ideals? Or was it merely the beginning of a much longer struggle for equality and justice in the United States? The American Revolution did not provide all the answers, but it set the stage for a future where the fight for freedom would continue, long after the guns of battle had fallen silent. Number 10. The United States of America. What kind of nation did the Revolution create? The American Revolution had succeeded, and a new nation had been born. But what kind of nation was the United States of America? Was it a true embodiment of the ideals that sparked the Revolution, or was it simply a collection of fractured states struggling to find unity? The creation of the United States was not without its challenges. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing document of the new country, proved to be ineffective. The states were deeply divided, and the central government had no real power to tax, enforce laws, or maintain order. The Revolution had secured freedom, but it had not yet secured the stability needed for the nation to thrive. It wasn't until 1787 that the Constitutional Convention was called to draft a new constitution. The result was the United States Constitution, a revolutionary document in its own right, creating a federal government with the ability to regulate commerce, raise taxes, and maintain a military. The Constitution also established a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. Yet, even the Constitution was not perfect. It left slavery intact, and the question of how to govern a nation as large and diverse as the United States remained unresolved. The American Revolution had won the fight for independence, but it had not answered every question. Could the United States remain united in the face of regional differences? Could the promises of liberty and equality be realized for all citizens? The Revolution may have ended the colonial era, but it had only begun the story of the United States. The ideals of the Revolution would continue to shape the nation, inspiring struggles for civil rights, women's rights, and social justice in the centuries to come. Conclusion. The American Revolution was more than just a fight for independence. It was a battle for the very principles that would define the United States for generations to come: liberty, equality, and self-determination. The war was not won easily, and its aftermath was filled with challenges, contradictions, and compromises. Yet, the revolution set in motion a chain of events that would change the world forever. The creation of the United States was a bold experiment in self-government, and it would inspire countless other nations to pursue their own struggles for freedom. But the revolution was also the beginning of an ongoing process, one in which the promises of liberty and justice would continue to be contested and redefined. As we look back on the American Revolution, it's clear that its legacy is far from simple. The ideals that emerged from this struggle would fuel future movements for change, and the questions raised during those early years about freedom, equality, and governance continue to resonate today. The revolution's true impact isn't just in the battles fought, but in the ideas that shaped the future of a nation. What kind of country did the revolution create? That is still a question we strive to answer today.